Welcome to the EMN podcast, where philosophy meets disaster and uncomfortable truths meet the profession we call emergency management. This is not safe space thinking. This is the arena. Let's begin. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are at. And well, today, right now, I'm by myself. But Dan, like I was last time, was on his way into the studio. Who knows? Maybe he might not make it. So Dan, if you're out there listening, stay safe on the freeway. But as you know, traffic is traffic, especially in California. And today we're talking about what does disaster reflect? And I wrote a piece called "Disaster is the Mirror," which means it doesn't show you. People don't come and make it up to where they need to be during a disaster, right? It just reflects what society completely is at the particular point. And disaster doesn't break a community. It really shows where the cracks already are. And what does that mean? What do we get into here? When a disaster hit, it seems like everything that we already know that is fragile, right? We already know where the collapses are going to be, whether it's societal, whether it's structural, right? We should have an understanding of the critical infrastructure, of the things that may or may not withstand that disaster. If we take a look at the big disasters that struck us worldwide, think about Maria hitting Puerto Rico. We understand that the electrical system in Puerto Rico is already fragile. So it shouldn't have come to a surprise that the electrical grid failed during that time. We should be preparing for those cracks in the infrastructure now. For disaster, right? Mitigation projects and things like this. This is what we do as a profession. So we know these things going into it. During COVID, when the politicians stood up and said, this is unprecedented. We could always look back at 1918, right? That wasn't unprecedented. Maybe due to the fact of sharing so quickly, was it precedented? Yeah, the social media portion of it, sure, right? Things like that. But the idea of a worldwide pandemic, we planned for, right? We call it pandemic flu, right? We didn't call it COVID. But we had practice sessions coming up right before that, right? We had MARS and SARS. These events that we're on the verge of these events. So we knew the cracks were there already. Daniel Aldrich wrote a couple of great books. One was on resilience, and the other one is a book that I used a lot in my teaching in the social impact of disaster. And this is kind of this paper I wrote I wrote the other day that was released on Sunday yesterday. Was kind of based on the class I wrote, Social Impacts of Disaster, which I really circled around the Black Wave with Aldrich's work on the triple disaster in Japan, where he really took a look at the society after the disaster. And the interesting aspect of how society reacted to those three. So there's the earthquake, number one, right? The tsunami, number two, and the nuclear emergency that occurred because of the tsunami. Each one of those disasters on their own would have created some serious issues with society, but the three of them together was an interesting study. If you have not read that book, I highly recommend it. It's called The Black Wave by Daniel Aldrich. Going into how people rejected, even if you weren't there during the nuclear emergency, how people rejected individuals that are coming from Fukushima to the point to where people would lie about where they came from. People broke off relationships, marriages, or not, or at least um, engagements to those people that were from that area. The fear of cancer, as if you could catch it, it used to be back in the 70s and stuff. People were afraid of catching cancer from those that had cancer, and that those fears came up again after the nuclear meltdown. And so society, I'm speaking great English this morning, society has those interesting fragilities that are built into what we have right now. And disaster doesn't create those breaks, right? It just shows them. And as I said, it's in the mirror. And the image I chose for that piece was a broken mirror in the middle of the desert. And I think that was apropos for it, because it really is the fractured mirror in a million pieces from the disaster. Because we have these historical layers that every community has. And back in the day, there's the concept of being on the other side of the tracks. And what does that mean? Does tribalism come out? Does those against us? Those concepts, do they flourish after disaster, or were they there prior to the disaster? Then how do we combat that prior to a disaster? And this is where I think we come into play as emergency management professionals. And I want to bridge this. No pun. I want to bridge this gap here. There's another article that I put on in LinkedIn, talking about the professionalism of emergency management and what that truly means when we start choosing who we need to have in these roles, and why it's not just a public safety position. In some cases, you can argue that it should be a public safety position at all. We, as in this position, are building that bridge between our government, and this is, I think, what we do the best, is build the bridge between the government, right, our elected officials, our big building here, which I'm sitting in a city hall, and the public in general. We build that with community programming. Now, we can look at disaster preparedness programming, and we can get into a huge debate about that, whether it's effective or not. And I have my feelings in that one. We won't share that today. But what I would like to see us get into is the concept of community capacity building. And what I mean by this, and Kyle King has some really good pieces on that if you want to read about this, and I'm on that train with Kyle a little bit. And I think I have my own twist on this, but what I mean by my take on community capacity building is to be able to take community organizations and empower them to really have as much training as possible amongst themselves. And I'm taking a look at faith-based organizations. I'm taking a look at these the clubs, such as like the Kiwanis clubs, um, the Rotary clubs, things like this. The other day I was watching a video from the Knights of Columbus, which again is a faith-based organization. They have a full disaster response organization associated with the Knights of Columbus through the Catholic Church. You have service organizations that are out there that have the ability to organize quickly and to bring people together. Why aren't we working with them on a regular basis to be able to help them build those capacity to be able to take care of their neighborhoods? We talk about CERT programs, and it's a very slim number of people compared to the amounts of residents that you have in your city that go through the CERT training, right? And they could take CERT-esque training, if you will, with these clubs and other organizations, and maybe even take the curriculum and build upon that. And that's what I'm talking about. And so what does that mean? Why do we go that level? Because there's social capital. And that social capital is built upon a couple different levels. You have tight-knit social capital, which is family members, right? And you have the loose social capital, which is people who know each other, loose connections, maybe through, like, say, LinkedIn, right? And we know how to use our social capital, say like our loose social capital through LinkedIn, to do certain things, like, especially in emergency management, is like, hey, do you have a plan that I could borrow? We're doing a JIC, for instance. Do you have a JIC plan that you've used in the past? Can I borrow that? And you're using that through a loose social capital connection. Put it out on LinkedIn. Hey, I'm doing this. And people jump on, yeah, I need that too. I'd love to borrow that and make it your own. So when you're building capacity amongst your community, you're building that through social capital, through social networks. And you're helping people create, I say building the bridge, you're helping people create these social networks through the community. So you have the DeVoe ads, right? Hitting the microphone. You have the DeVoe ads, right? And those are specific for volunteer organizations for disasters, right? But is the Women's League of Voters, for instance, they're not a DeVoe ad, right? They're not necessarily a disaster or volunteer organization. But man, could you get in front of them and have them become a conduit to disaster and preparedness for their own homes? Can you get in front of them to be champions for what you're doing in your community? Could they be champions to the next disaster group, to the church? Could they be champions to another organization that's out there? And it's building that social capital amongst those organizations that's building capacity in your community and building those bridges. And as an emergency manager, and I say this a lot, is getting out from behind the desk and getting out into the community to be able to do this. Because this is the only way you're going to be able to fix those cracks in the society that you're looking at, to be able to see where they're at. Because again, when a disaster strikes, it's going to show those cracks that were already there. We need to be building those bridges today in the blue sky days. When the gray skies come, it's too late. Infrastructure as a destiny. And that's what you have to think of. Those failures will come. We've seen it. Hurricane Katrina, right? We saw how the infrastructure failed, and because the infrastructure failed, right, we saw the lower Ninth Ward get destroyed, right? What happened there wasn't just a failure of that infrastructure. It was the failure of the connections of the community. It was the failure of the connections of the community between the community members and their government. The community members and those of us that are supposed to be servant leaders. That social connection was not there. We need to take a human view of disasters. And I'm going to challenge everybody here today to really look at that social impact, as we've been talking about here today, that social impact of what it truly means. And that we can start today in the blue sky days. We can start to take a look at how we build that capacity for our community to be ready, not just for the large scale disasters, but for the small things. I have spoken about this before. We had the Neighbor for Neighbor program in a community that I worked in. And it was almost, for lack of a better term, if you think of a neighborhood watch group, right? And they were together with the idea of a neighborhood watch with a little bit of a spin with the disaster preparedness side of it. And they started taking care of each other. So much so that there was this one elderly female who was a shut-in who was using Access, which is a function that we have here in Southern California. Might be other places too, where the transportation comes, picks her up, take her to the doctor, things like this. And the neighbors didn't really know her well, knew that there was an old elderly lady that lived there, but didn't know too much about her. But they got together at the point and said, hey, we could start taking care of her as well. And they started taking her to her doctor's appointments, doing shopping for her, taking her out, and really made her part of that neighborhood again. And she was a lonely woman, and they adopted her basically as the neighborhood. And again, this is not a disaster issue. This is building community. And in the time of a disaster, this is when they can check on each other and know that she's okay, or if she needs assistance. And this is what I'm talking about. This is the capacity that I'm saying that we need to build, and to build the neighborhoods. People know each other and their neighbors. In some communities it's harder than others, but if we could be that bridge to where we could have neighbors that get to meet each other again and build that sense of community again, I think it's worth it. Because disasters do not break the community. It shows where the cracks already are. And I think we could be that conduit to stop the cracks. We can mitigate those issues. So today we're going to close off a little early. I know Dan's traveling, and hope that he travels safe. Hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I spent a great one with my family, and we will see you next week. We will do a special episode here shortly, talking about the 10 books that the top 10 books that belong on your bookshelf. I know a few of us have different books that we think belong there for the holidays. And also, don't forget that if you act today, if you're an IAEM member, right, International Association of Emergency Managers, if you're a member of this organization, you get 75% off of a paid membership for EMN. And that is a $75 savings, and you get all of the inside information that's happening here at EMN. And we will be starting a monthly live stream where you get to interact with us, ask questions, chat. It's going to be fun. We will be doing it through a Google invite, and it'll just be a bunch of us sitting around talking about what we talk about, and that will be only for members only. So if you want to get involved with that, it's only $25 for the year if you are an IEM member. I look forward to seeing you there. And until next time, please stay safe.
When the sirens scream out loud, we're the voice that breaks the cloud. Heads out high when things go wrong, we'll guide you through with strength and song. Disaster strikes without a sound, chaos reigns but we're around. Public safety in our hands, standing strong in every land.